Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Glad you could be here. I have a great episode lined up for you today. It piggybacks off Monday's episode and my conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. The world, it's a complex place, and you have all these so-called foreign policy experts who want to oversimplify international relations. The complexities of international relations and the potential for World War III, it's a real conversation that we need to have. Unfortunately, if too many public officials and those within the media industrial complex, plus the virtue signalers out there, they don't want to have a real conversation, and they want to make it as if we're still living in 1980s America. We're living in a 1980s world. They think they're smarter than everyone else, and they think that they can control outcomes, but the reality is far from true. Notice how whenever anyone raises questions, they attack that person, they try and demonize them, they try to apply all these labels. See, when you engage in those types of tactics, it just shows you can't debate the issues. It shows how shallow you really are if you have to engage in name-calling. I am sick and tired of hearing that you're emboldening Russia if you ask questions. No. What emboldens Russia is the lack of a coherent policy and announcing every damn move that we make, every single weapon system that's being delivered to Ukraine. This is what emboldens Russia. This is what allows Putin to say, see, I was right. NATO wants to destroy Mother Russia. He's going to play on the Russian nationalistic sentiment in order to increase support. And unfortunately, we are so simple-minded that we think everyone around the world looks at these issues from an American prism. I saw a headline earlier in the week that talked about civil war in Russia, and I hate to break it to everyone, but that isn't even a remote possibility at this point. And we could keep pretending, just like we're going to pretend that this is a war for democracy. We could keep doing that, but it's not going to do us any good. I get it. Putin is a horrible human being. Putin has committed crimes against humanity. I have zero doubt of that. But so has the CCP of China. The CCP that's currently in the midst of committing genocide against an entire group of people, where they've slaughtered far more. Where's all the moral holy warriors, the public virtue signalers? Where are they? Why are they so silent on China when it comes to the human rights abuses, the gross human rights abuses we're going to see? When we look at a lot of authoritarian countries out there, there's human rights abuses every single day. Does that mean that we engage in conflict with all these countries? Because if it does, then we'll never survive. What I'm trying to say is that if all hell breaks loose, it's not my generation that's going to be doing the fighting. What I don't want to see, though, is 18, 19-year-old kids coming back in flag-draped coffins. All these public virtue signalers out there, they're not the ones who are going to be doing the fighting. It's easy to be tough when you don't have to put anything on the line, and that's what we're witnessing today. I wonder how many of those with Ukrainian flags on their social media profiles are going to be singing a different tune if all hell breaks out, World War III begins. We are now over the one-year mark since Russia invaded Ukraine. And what is the strategy of the United States today? This administration has yet to lay out clear strategic objectives of what we want the end result to be. I'm talking smart objectives, objectives that are simple, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. We need a coherent strategy that represents our interests. And everyone needs to understand that not every country's interests align with each other, no matter how much we want it to or what some are trying to say out there. There are several questions that we need answers to, and I'm going to raise those questions. More importantly, in this episode, I'm going to outline the different interests of four countries: the United States, Ukraine, Russia, and China. How we are beginning to witness the theater of war expand. The longer this conflict goes on, I warned about it in February of 2022. The longer the conflict goes on, the bigger threat it poses to the international community, the more instability gets introduced into the international community, and the more likely that the theater of war will expand. I'm going to outline the different interests. We have the Biden administration that's bumbling our way into World War III. You have both Democrats and Republicans supporting this, and we should be having a real conversation. Anyone who tells you that World War III isn't a realistic possibility either has no clue what they're talking about, or they're just flat out lying. All we have to do is look. History can be our guide. And just so everyone is aware, we could keep up with the public virtue signaling, we could keep up with the stupid slogans, but understand that if the theater of war expands, your entire way of life as you know it is going to be gone. Doesn't matter what your political ideology is, doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, it's irrelevant. So I believe that it's a conversation worth having. It would be irresponsible not to have this conversation. And that's what we need to discuss. I'm going to get to it all. Before I do, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you find the show informative, make sure to share it with your family and friends. I want to hear what you think. Write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. Or drop me an email, podcast@PASreport.com. And jumping right in, picture international politics as a game of chess. You have to remain 3 steps ahead of your adversaries. You have to anticipate what they're going to do. You have to anticipate the moves of your allies. You have to watch out for all the different minefields that exist. More importantly, you have to be careful of miscalculations and oversteps. I do this podcast for several reasons. Obviously, I have a love of politics, always had, and so I enjoy discussing it. And I believe that we have to be informed. For too long, people have disengaged from the political process, and I understand why. I mean, it's constant negativity. You see officials who could care less about the people they've sworn to serve, and it feels like we've been abandoned by both Democrats and Republicans, but that's not an excuse to not be informed. We have to be informed. You are living through one of the most consequential times, not just in American history, but also human history. And you are living proof of what happens when people within a populace disengage from the political process, all the corruption that we see. You get the clowns we have in office now. And I'm not just speaking about the Biden administration. Obviously, we see the incompetence of people like Secretary Buttigieg, Secretary Mayorkas, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky. I mean, just look at the whole COVID response. Look at the disaster that turned out to be, all based on false information, whether it's about natural immunity, whether it's where did the virus leak out from, whether it's about mask mandates and lockdowns. I mean, the amount of damage these idiots inflicted on our society is enormous, but it's not just Democrats. It's Republicans, too. They're not much better. They, too, have abandoned their constituency. They, too, support policies that undermine American interests. So I believe being informed is essential because only then can we hold officials accountable. I also do this podcast for educational purposes. There are many complexities in the realm of international politics, and one should know the ins and outs. One of the tools that political scientists use are the levels of analysis that try to understand why countries behave the way they do, and it allows us to try and predict how a country is going to react in certain situations. The levels of analysis are critical. I've spoken about them in previous episodes. Every country is different. Every country has a different set of self-interest. The global system is based on power. You might not like that. You might disagree with that. But that doesn't change the reality. International relations, we have to understand the study of relationships between countries, leaders, intergovernmental organizations, and then you have idiots that want to empower them over the sovereignty of nation states, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations. The policy governing international relations is foreign policy, and it's usually going to consist of self-interest strategies and to safeguard our national interests, to achieve our goals on the world stage. Given the nature of globalization, we have been witnessing the merging of domestic and foreign policies as they become more intertwined, and most policies today are considered interdomestic policies. Power is essential in the international community, and that's what nations fight for. Power. Think about it. Territorial expansion, the acquisition of natural resources. Those things are power. Power is the sum of a country's capabilities. It's essential and the necessary vehicle to achieve your self-interest goals. In order for a country to advance their foreign policy agenda, they have to use statecraft. They have to apply those capabilities on a world stage. Now, sure, I just glossed over it. When it comes to international politics, we could talk an entire semester about these things. But I want to delve into the Russia war in Ukraine, and I want to explain several things that worry me. The first concern, the major concern that I have, is a lack of coherent policy by this administration. As I stated at the beginning, this administration has yet to lay out what our national interests are. They haven't explained what their strategic objectives are. These smart objectives. All we hear is that this is a fight for the future of democracy. It's for democracy. That's laughable. And I'm going to tell you why. But the administration, other officials, and I'm talking both Democrats and Republicans. I'm not just simply putting this on the backs of the Biden administration. I'm talking about both parties. All I hear is that the strategy is for as long as it takes. That we're in this for as long as it takes. Just take a listen to this.
Freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes, and that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
As the president has said, Shannon, we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Again, the United States will continue to strongly support Ukraine, and we will do so for as long as it takes.
As President Biden has said, we will stand with Ukraine in its fight for as long as it takes.
Sorry, but that's not a real strategy. Saying that we will continue for as long as it takes is a lie. What if the war goes on for another 10 years? What if it goes on for another 5 years? I mean, you are aware that with the amount of money, are we really going to continue to fund this to the tune of over $100 billion a year for as long as it takes? We've already spent over 15% of what we spent on 8 years of war in Iraq. Now think about that. We were on the ground actually fighting in Iraq and had to rebuild the entire country. Are we really going to spend more than that for a war that we're not even really fighting in? I mean, that to me is insane. Keep in mind, the support we've provided Ukraine is double Russia's annual military budget. It's 1,600% of Ukraine's annual military budget. Think about that for a minute. Are we really going to degrade our own military readiness and capabilities by providing, or really continuing to provide all these weapon systems? Are we really going to do that? What if the war lasts another 2, 3, 4 years? I mean, we already know that our stockpiles are depleted. We already have generals warning that our military readiness is 25% below the levels they should be at. So can we just be honest and realistic about this whole thing? But we can't, right? We can't possibly be honest and say our current levels of commitment are unsustainable, that we're not going to be able to keep up the current pace. We're not going to be able to do that. However, sorry, Mr. President and the Biden administration, stating that we're going to be in this for as long as it takes, it's not only unfair to the American people, but it's unfair to our allies as well. It's also unfair to the Ukrainian people that have to suffer under this war. More importantly, Ukrainian leaders need to know that there are limits to the levels of support we're going to provide. Again, let's just be honest about this. Ukraine is not Britain or France. They're not America's most key allies to ever exist. We don't necessarily have a ton of interest in the Ukraine. There are some, don't get me wrong, and I'm going to get to those. But it's important to be mindful that every country has their own set of interests. The administration, members of Congress from both parties, the media, the so-called experts out there, the ones that make up the pundit class, they continue to push this idea that the United States and Ukraine have the same national interests. That's a lie. But you can't have a rational conversation because people would rather virtue signal and develop policies, no matter how incoherent, no matter how much they actually hurt the United States. They'd rather develop policies based on emotion and what they hope happens as opposed to the reality of what's likely to happen. And there is no clear strategic vision. Saying we're going to support Ukraine for an indefinite amount of time is not a realistic policy, no matter how much you hope that's the case. And notice that no one has explained what exactly we want to see as the end result in Ukraine. Not the Biden administration, not Republicans. Nobody knows what the end game looks like. They're not putting it out there. Some are going to argue that it's the complete surrender and withdrawal of Russian forces. Others are going to say, once Putin's disposed of, once we have regime change in Russia. Again, those aren't real strategies, and they aren't necessarily in our national interest. First of all, we cannot forget that Russia is still the superior military and can keep this fight going for a while. Obviously, Putin has little regard for life, including his own troops, and he'll continue to send them to the slaughter until he starts to change the momentum. So it's not likely that the Russian army is going to surrender anytime soon. Be honest about that. Don't sit there and lie to the American people thinking that Russia's on the verge of surrender and withdrawal from Ukraine. They're not. They're not even close to that point. When we talk about regime change of Vladimir Putin, yeah, Vladimir Putin is a horrible human being, but there's a lot of those as world leaders. Maduro's no cupcake either. You have the Saudi royal family. You have the Ayatollah of Iran, the communist regime of China, Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So are we going to say that all those people need to be deposed of too? Are we going to push for that? And what if Putin is deposed? Not for nothing, but most of the people talking about Russia have no clue about internal Russian politics. I hate to break it to you. It's not like the opposition's going to be able to take over Russia. It's not like those Russians that are opposed to Vladimir Putin are the ones that are going to come into place next. They're not. Odds are that the person that takes over Putin's place is going to be more hardline than Putin himself. But we're not going to be honest about that. We're going to sit here and lie and pretend. Now, if we look at every country's interest, let's just take a look, right? America's foreign policy and what's in America's interest. It's in our interest to see a weakened Russia. There are some who want to defend Putin. That's just bizarre to me. There's some that want to defend Putin's policies. But we need to be honest about this, okay? Neither of these countries is the beacon of democracy, whether it's Russia or Ukraine. There's a lot of corruption in both countries. And let's not pretend that Putin's some good guy out there. He's not. This was a war of aggression. There's no... Ukraine didn't pose any realistic threat to Russia. We need to get that. So for those that want to defend Putin, while you're defending them, you just hurt your own credibility. Putin is not a good guy. However, just because I say he's not a good guy doesn't mean that we should just go in and try and overthrow him. That doesn't make sense either. It doesn't mean that we should go to war with Russia. I also don't think the CCP is a good regime. I'm not calling for war with China. Understand, Russia is a natural adversary to the United States. They seek to expand their power and influence throughout the international community. Our foreign policy is designed to maintain our power and influence. Not that we use that right, but we have to realize that power is a zero-sum game. In order for one country to gain power, another country has to lose power. And so the foreign policy of the United States and the foreign policy of Russia is always going to conflict with each other. Now, just because Russia is a natural adversary, it doesn't mean that you can't have a strong working relationship with an adversary. We have worked with Russia and cooperated on a number of issues, whether it's Islamic terrorism, the loose nuke program, the space program, a whole host of issues. We work closely with China. Obviously, China is our biggest adversary out there. They're the ones that pose the most realistic threat to our power and influence around the world. We still work closely with China, though. So it is in our interest to see a weakened Russia, which has already been accomplished. Russia is significantly weaker today than before the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It's also in our interest to have sane control over the policies of the Ukraine, especially given the billions of dollars we've invested, the military support that we've provided. So yes, we get to control their policies. We've accomplished that as well. What do you think? That we give this money with no strings attached? You think that we provide all this foreign aid to all these countries around the world just because of, out of the kindness of our hearts? Because of democracy, right? That's right. We're fighting for democracy. I mean, come on. We give this money because we know that giving money and aid buys us influence. And if we're going to be honest to the American people, if we're going to have politicians, public officials that actually serve the American people as opposed to the other way around, we should look at what our strategic interests are. And we've accomplished those strategic interests. Russia's weaker. We control Ukraine's policies. Don't you think that we should now be forcing a diplomatic solution at this point? And guess what? If we do force a diplomatic solution, get the two sides to a table, force them to come to an agreement, doesn't that make the United States more powerful on the world stage? That we were the only country that had the ability to bring these two to the table and force a compromise? Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and the longer it goes on, the more difficult it's going to be. However, understand that there's this whole nefarious group in Washington, D.C. that doesn't want to see a diplomatic solution. They're still living under the Cold War mentality. They're living under a reality that doesn't exist. And instead, they think that they can control this situation. They don't see it spiraling out of control, but I'll explain how it can spiral out of control. Now, let's take a look at what Ukraine's interests are, because obviously Ukraine has different interests than the United States. Ukrainians are fighting for their survival, and it's in their interest to see Russia withdraw from all areas of the Ukraine, including Crimea. However, we need to understand as Americans that that's not realistic for two reasons. First of all, Russia has already stated that Crimea is a red line, and they are going to throw everything they can to keep the Crimea. Like I keep on saying throughout this episode, we have to be honest about the situation. Tell the truth. We have to recognize, I don't care what the media is reporting out there. I don't care what the pundits are saying or what the officials are saying. Russia still has the superior military. Doesn't mean that Ukraine can't win, but the odds aren't in their favor. And so we have to be realistic. The only realistic way for Ukraine to defeat the Russian military, there's only one realistic way, and that's to draw the United States into a kinetic war with Russia. That's the only way. And understand, that's exactly what some people are trying to do. You know, there's a lot of people out there that are way too trusting of Ukrainian officials, especially Zelensky. Now, I know people have put Zelensky on this pedestal where you can't criticize him. If you criticize him, then you're criticizing democracy itself. Like Fauci, embodiment of science, Zelensky is the embodiment of democracy. That's how these idiots operate. That's what their arguments essentially are. Now, Zelensky is the leader of Ukraine. He's not going to do what's in America's interest. He's going to do what he deems is in his country's interest, in his people's interest. They want to put Zelensky on this pedestal as if he could do no wrong. And comparing Zelensky to the second coming of Churchill is insulting and ridiculous. First of all, his constant demands are infuriating. And then this guy has the nerve to say that Americans that raise questions, well, that's dangerous. Because if Ukraine loses, according to Zelensky, Russia's going to begin to invade the Baltic states. The United States is going to be forced to send sons and daughters to war, and they'll be dying. At the current path we're on, that's what's going to happen already. Not Russia invading the Baltic, but the United States being forced to send sons and daughters to a war in a far-off place and coming back in flag-draped coffins. Also, I'm not sure Zelensky understands how free societies work. You don't ban media outlets. You don't ban opposition parties. He doesn't understand that freedom of thought and freedom of speech, that they're essential in free societies, that people are allowed to ask questions. Asking questions is not dangerous. Questions aren't a threat to democracy. If a democracy cannot withstand questions, that democracy doesn't deserve to stand at all. See, the ones that are dangerous are the officials who say that you can't ask questions. But let's keep pretending this is about democracy, when it's not. It's actually about geopolitical power plays for territory, natural resources, for power. That's what it comes down to. And over the last few weeks, you have to pay attention because our media doesn't like to report it. But over the past few weeks, you've had a number of Ukrainian officials talking about expanding the theater of war. Just a few weeks ago, there were reports that Ukrainian authorities said that Russian cities are bound to suffer attacks and that escalation is inevitable. And the officials stated cities are pampered, lazy, and that thought that they lived in a different reality, such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, will be subject to strikes. Understand that if that's really the case, if we do start seeing cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg get attacked, we are no longer talking about a defensive war just to repel Russian forces and push back on the units. Okay, if we start to see attacks on Russian cities, that means the geographic scope of the war has expanded. And in full disclosure, the Ukrainian official did state that Ukraine has no plans to carry out such an attack. But that raises an even bigger question. If the Ukrainian officials are saying that we're going to see attacks on Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and Ukraine officials saying that they don't have any plans on attacking the Russian cities, then who is going to attack the Russian cities? I'd like to know. Do these officials know something that we don't? Then just last week, you had a top Ukrainian security official stated that the war ends with Ukrainian tanks in Red Square, meaning Moscow. That's the top security chief in Ukraine. Again, I don't think it's realistic, and we should be asking the question, what's up with this rhetoric? What's up with the rhetoric that soon attacks are going to be happening inside Russia? Are you trying to unnerve the Russian people in hopes that it's going to lead to Russians putting pressure on Putin? Or is something else going on here? I don't have an answer to that. I wish I did. And maybe some of our people in the press will actually ask that question. However, again, it comes down to being realistic. If Russia feels like a military assault on Russian cities is going to happen, well, it's not going to be Ukrainian weaponry that allows Ukrainians to attack Russian cities. It's going to have to be American weaponry. Are Ukrainian officials using this rhetoric hoping that Russia preemptively strikes U.S. interests with the hope of directly drawing us into the war? Again, I don't know what the answer is, but it is something that is worth asking. Now, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I'm going to talk about Russia's interest in this whole thing, and I'm going to talk about China's interests. So sit tight, and I'll be back after this short break. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared bed for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get yours today. Welcome back. Turning our attention to Russia, it's obviously in their interest to win. They want to expand their territory, have control over vital natural resources in the region. It's a power play, and it's especially in Putin's interests. It usually doesn't work out too well for Russian leaders that lose wars. See, Russia isn't like the United States. You can't spend 20 years at war to the tune of over $1 trillion, 2,500 soldiers dead, tens of thousands of wounded. In the United States, you get promotion like General Milley, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and so many others. In Russia, if you lose a war, particularly one like this, you're dead. And it wouldn't be from the opposition groups that actually kill Putin. It's going to be from Putin's own inner circle. They will be the ones to take him out for two reasons. First of all, self-preservation. They're going to blame Putin for not executing the war right. Remember, in politics, it's always the ones closest to you that are going to be the first ones to plunge the dagger in your back. For Putin, there is a lot at stake. And for someone that was so methodical throughout their career, this was the biggest miscalculation Putin has ever made. And it may cost him his life. But there's something more concerning to me. The longer this goes on, the more pressure there's going to be on Putin to be even more brutal. At what point does Putin begin to get backed into a corner? Not by the United States. I mean, listen, if we really wanted to hurt Russia, we should crash the oil prices. You want to destroy the Russian economy, flood the markets with oil and natural gas, crash the prices, but then again, that goes against their whole climate agenda, so it's not really about Russia, if you see what I mean. But if Putin does get backed into a corner by his own hardliners, that the more American weaponry flows into the Ukraine to kill Russian soldiers, the more pressure they begin to put on him to target U.S. interests. To say that this won't happen, that's wishful thinking. If we were at war with Canada and China was supplying tons of weapons to kill American soldiers, you think we're just going to sit back and allow China to keep those weapons flowing without any type of retaliation, especially if we feel our backs against the wall and we have to respond? We all know the answer to that. So Russia's interests are very different than our interests. We also have to look at China, and since Putin is seeking to shore up his relationship with Xi Jinping of China, it's important to look at China's interests because they are the ones that are laughing behind the scenes. Leave it to the boneheads in Washington to empower the single greatest threat to American power and influence since the Soviet Union. You have all these foreign policy experts sounding the alarm over the alliance between the two nations, but it's not a real alliance. China doesn't want to see a strong power to their north. They want to see a dependent country to their north, and that's what they're getting. It's nothing more than an alliance of convenience. Remember, before Putin gave the green light for the invasion, he met with Jinping. And while it's speculation on my part, I would almost guarantee that Xi was instigating the invasion by telling Putin, you got to protect your sovereignty, you got to protect your territorial integrity. Don't let the United States dictate to you. Don't let the United States threaten you, instigating and pushing Putin. Now there are reports that China is going to be providing Russia with military arms because Russia's stockpiles are dwindling. Do you think the CCP is going to provide these arms for free at the expense of Chinese taxpayers like we're doing with the Ukraine? Or do you think that China is going to provide these arms in return for greatly discounted prices on oil and natural gas? I can assure you it's the latter. See, China would love to bleed both the United States and Russia, and they wouldn't mind seeing the two sides engage in minimal conflict. Let's face it, China doesn't want World War III because it hurts their bottom line. Americans still need to buy their products. But don't for a second think that China isn't laughing behind the scenes right now. Draw the United States and Russia into a conflict, let them hurt each other, and then China lays claim to the dominant world power without ever firing a shot. And we're giving them exactly what they want. See, I don't think any of the countries I just mentioned, I don't think any of them want to see World War III. All the countries in the European continent don't want to see World War III. It's why French President Macron or the German Chancellor are saying that we need to find a way out of this diplomatically. They're not getting any attention, which is interesting because it's in Europe's own backyard. You would think that we would show some interest in what they're saying. But history is replete with examples of how mixed messages and miscalculations lead to wider conflicts. Officials should fear an all-out escalation because it will be an escalation where all the players lose. We are talking about two countries that have enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world 23 times. Russia at 6,200, the United States at about 5,600. Should we really be chancing the possibilities of this escalating with the potential for nuclear strikes? I mean, maybe officials should look to begin to de-escalate the situation, not antagonize it. When we look at World War II, Germany, Britain, and France were the dominant powers. And what happened to them? What happened to them coming out of World War II? Well, they destroyed each other. This is not going to be any different. This is not me being pro-Kremlin to all you fools out there that want to criticize it. This is not me cozying up to Vladimir Putin being a Russian agent. I just think that the idea of getting into World War III over Ukraine is just a little ridiculous. I'm just saying. Even if the war ends and it doesn't escalate, are any of our policymakers thinking about what the United States-Russian relationship looks like after this? Are we just going to cut all ties to Russia and push them closer into China's sphere of influence? Not for nothing. But President Nixon and subsequent administrations, they made a concerted effort to be sure that a wedge existed between China and the Soviets. Both were horrible regimes, but at a time, it made sense. We're going to bring China closer to us. In this situation, we're doing the exact opposite, and it's because you have so many in power that don't have any real leadership skills. You have so many in power that just think in the here and now. They're very simple-minded, and they still have that Cold War mentality. It's amazing that we are closer to war with Russia today than we were in the 47 years of the Cold War. And I would argue that we are closer to war today than we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The difference is that we had real leadership back then. We had officials who were smart. Officials who understood the dynamics of world affairs. Officials that actually cared about the American people. Sadly, there are very few like that in leadership today. Instead, it's about emotion, not reason or logic. This is the position that we're finding ourselves in. Now, I will guarantee you that if you polled the American people, the overwhelming majority have no stomach for another endless war, especially one that could prove catastrophic. The short-sightedness of the policymakers shows their incompetence. People really need to stop making it as if America's interests and Ukraine's interests line up and they're the same, because they are not. I understand the Ukraine is fighting for their sovereignty. I understand they're fighting for their survival. I get that. And I feel sympathy for the Ukrainian people. But Ukraine is much more complex than you're being told. It's not this beacon of democracy that some want to portray it as. And there are numerous separatist groups that make this conflict extraordinarily complicated, where there's not going to be a real winner at the end of this. And everyone could lose. We should be pushing for an end to the conflict because, unfortunately, our officials are creating a situation that they can't possibly control. And it shouldn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. If this powder keg explodes, our way of life is never going to be the same. The bubble that insulates us from what's happening around the world, it will burst. And we as a society will suffer, regardless if you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, or Libertarian. We have to ask these questions. We have to have this conversation. We have to talk about how much money they're doling out. It amazes me how quick they are to spend our tax dollars, especially with everything going on here at home. The outflow of cash with no accountability. It's stunning. Remember when they told us that we couldn't do a border wall because the $25 billion price tag was too expensive? Our policymakers are more concerned about what happens thousands of miles away rather than what's going on right in our own backyard. And they say, well, we're doing it to make sure that the war doesn't come here. That's their argument. But what if it does? And what if they're the ones that are walking us into that? That's why I do this podcast. To talk about these issues, to inform, to educate, to ask questions that very few are asking. This is a conversation that should be happening, and sadly, it's not. Now, if you found this episode informative, please share it with others and on your social media accounts. I appreciate all the 5-star ratings and written reviews on any podcast platform that allows it. As for Monday, I got a great guest coming in. Phenomenal new book. We're going to talk about it on Monday. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.